Hello and welcome back, everybody. I'll be sending out an email shortly. Just trying to find my water. Sorry I wasn't able to post lectures or respond or be active last week. Last summer I had COVID and experienced some neurological problems a few months later. And evidently that happened on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday this week. So I was kind of out of it and have to go to the hospital to be evaluated next week. But I'm feeling pretty well now and ready to talk about neo-feudalism and so on. I also have one of the TAs who's updating the syllabus, so it matches the website. Right now, everything on the website, on the Gaucho Space page is accurate. So keep up the good work. Just kind of like bear with me as I try and get back into place. So I did want to go through a few things. We've made quite a bit of progress. A reminder that the extra credit is due yesterday, so I'll talk more about that. I'll send an email about that and how that can affect your grade, how it'll be calculated, that sort of thing. So what we were doing last week then, we're getting into the Dark Enlightenment, and I posted the lecture on political theology and millenarianism, and this sort of like end of the world movements and so on, which is essentially how I view things like accelerationism and those types of QAnon, for example, those types of movements. So now, last week, we moved into the Empire of Anarchy, which is such a cool subsection title. I read the last chapter that you'll be reading in the Lockman book, which is on state breakdowns, and I'll be talking about a couple of state breakdowns in Africa for a lot of this lecture. And I'll also go over the Adrian Pabst reading, Commonwealth and Covenant, where he makes this argument that, we're no longer living in this neoliberal order or this, post-World War II order or whatever you want to call it, that we've now entered something that's more similar to what we saw in medieval time, during medieval times in Europe and so on, rather than here. That does not mean that, we're all going to be wearing chainmail and, Game of Thrones sort of thing. It's not like that, but the power structures seem to be changing, and maybe we're wrong, but we'll see. And then next week, I'll be uploading lectures about China and Chinese political culture, because this is the new sort of political movement that's on the rise. And that's, going to be rapidly reshaping the world. So anyway, a lot of important stuff coming down the line. Then we get into more sort of almost kind of psychology, kind of social psychology, looking at authoritarianism, who gravitates toward authoritarianism. We'll also be looking at arguments that say that, Trump voters represent some new strand of authoritarianism, others who say that they are actually not authoritarian. So anyway, and I will talk about those later. I changed the rough draft of the paper to May 24th. And then the final draft is the next week, and it won't take you as long as you think. You're just going to be addressing the suggestions and criticisms the teaching assistant and I shall make. Okay, so I did just want to give kind of an update about where we are and where we're going and so on and so forth. Okay, that's the wrong lecture. Let's see, I should bring up the the correct lecture. That would be good. Okay, here we go. All right, so this reading then, the Pabst reading, is coming out of this journal called Telos. A couple of professors of mine were important in getting it started. It's somewhat controversial depending upon your view, but they had this fantastic issue a few years ago called The West, Its Past and Its Prospects. And it talks about, what the West is, what it was, what it tried to be, and so on. So at the end of the day, the West is... It's a liberal society, and I mean liberalism in the sort of broadest sense of permitting individual rights, protecting free markets, private property, democracy, all of these sorts of things. And it's not an ideology that binds people together in the same way that, say communism does, or a religion does, or something like that. Liberalism is focused a lot on individualism. And Emil Durkheim, the famous sociologist, as we talked about earlier, he was worried about this situation where individualism would be promoted so much to the point that, people are just going their own ways and there's nothing really holding society together anymore. So if the West has given one thing to the world, it's this idea of liberalism. And again, Ronald Reagan fits under liberalism, under this definition, and so on. So what Adrian Pabst argues in this reading that you've done for class is that basically liberalism is what's sometimes called a rules-based order, which basically means, you set up a standard set of rules for the society. Hold on one moment, I've got an issue with my other computer that's supposed to be helping me along here. Okay. Anyway, so the Pabst argues that that's not enough, that, we're entering this new world where people are looking for something more. And so he argues for a post-liberal associationism, where there's, more of a focus on things like virtue, and so on. I'm not going to read all of these, but he lays out these 8 ideas that are kind of determinative of the West, things that we often see. Sorry, I'm getting frustrated with my other device over here. Yeah. All right, okay. So a lot of the ideas about the West come out of the Middle Ages, and they come out of antiquity, so the late Roman period, and so on. Okay, get this thing to work eventually. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. Okay, so, and the thing about the West is they basically treat it as almost like the end point of history, that it kind of takes the place of all other histories, that this is the one sort of true history. Everything else is kind of anecdotal, traditional, backwards, that sort of thing. Another key thing about the Western hegemony, is connected with the fall of the Catholic Church, at least in its power, and the rise of Protestantism. Now, this historicism treats history as fated and all-determining, teleological, and based on sort of iron laws. I won't go through all of this. The one thing that I do want to point out here is that the main thing that Adrian Pabst and others like John Gray, argue is that we've taken a lot of the logic that came out of religion and have applied it to the Westphalian order of sovereign states. And so we've kind of desacralized the public square and sacralized what used to be secular. And this is sometimes referred to as the axial age. Now, what's interesting, and I think it's good that he points this out, is that most of the West, or what's considered the West, is still unfolding its sort of ideas on Jerusalem and Rome. You haven't had very many true revolutions in Western countries, except for the United States and most dramatically France. But for the most part, the West is still basically in between Jerusalem, religion, and Rome. The early ancient sort of pagan ideas and traditions in Europe long ago. So Pabst argues for more associative approaches, and kind of obnoxiously, he doesn't spend a whole lot of time, laying out just how these things would work and how they would be a whole lot different than what we see in the systems that we already have in liberal democracy and so on. But associative approaches are basically pretty similar to what's called communitarianism. Communitarianism then tries to find a middle ground between liberalism and conservatism, left and right, that sort of thing. And I think it's a way of thinking that that a lot of people could benefit from learning about, from recognizing, well, like communitarians, recognizing that nothing's going to be perfect for you, and that society really is this balance between rights and responsibilities. We've seen a kind of a rise in interest in communitarianism since COVID-19, which I think makes sense, as both states and markets, generally speaking, have not done a great job responding to COVID, especially in the early months. So Pabst also talks about the United Nations and the problems that it's facing. And, I tend to support the United Nations when they do good things. The problem with the United Nations, though, is that at the end of the day, there's still, there's not much they can do if the United States decides to do something, or if Russia or China decides to do something. So they're still kind of at the beck and call of the major powers. I mean, the U.S. and Israel have like this super long track record of, ignoring, various things coming out of the United Nations. So the United Nations, though, it kind of represents a key liberal organization. I mean, it was found, as we talked about, it was founded after the Second World War, as a way to prevent war from happening, have, people come together to discuss things, a very great, noble ideal. As the world changed and the human population grew by several billion, it took on more responsibilities, and more recently it's taken on this responsibility to protect, because it failed to do so in Rwanda and many other places where there have been different conflicts and very murderous atrocities. Now, one of the challenges here, though, is that one of the key things about the United Nations is that they kind of they don't want to get involved in other countries' internal affairs. They try not to intervene, go over their sovereignty and things like this. But they end up having to do that, and the responsibility to protect kind of necessitates that. So right there, you've got kind of a big contradiction of, okay, where and when does the UN get involved? Because most people have agreed that we would like to see a world where, if there's genocidal violence, the UN comes in and at least, stands in the way for a bit, kind of raises the alarm, that sort of thing. I've done a lot of work on genocide myself, and I know the UN has done great work in, with their limited resources, while, the rest of the world just kind of look the other way. So in your book, one of the things that's talked about is this axial age, which was developed by this philosopher named Karl Jaspers. And here what he's kind of talking about is that there's this kind of 600-year span of time in the first millennium BCE, going to basically the 3rd century BCE. BC, yeah. So anyway, so he's kind of interested in this, and he writes this book. What was going on in the world that you had Buddha, Socrates, Confucius, Jeremiah, and these others, very important religious figures that are moving about in different parts of the world, spreading their ideas, and to this day we know who they are. And so he calls this, as I said, the axial age. And one of the things that he's pointing out is that you have this long history of empires in the world, and times throughout history where we think we've got things figured out, that we've finally got it together. Yeah, there's still some crime and war and conflict, but that's ebbing, and so on and so forth. And so anywhere we're approaching something similar. So Pabst, like I said, he has this idea for commonwealth, and the name of the article is Covenant and Commonwealth. And like I said, I was a little dismayed that there was not more explanation about what a commonwealth would look like. There's the British Commonwealth. They have a certain, relationship. It's not like a trade relationship like with the European Union or something like this. It's kind of a formal cultural recognition, former colonies of Britain sort of thing. But he's saying that we should kind of look at these ideas of commonwealth and think about applying them instead of the indifferent kind of rule-based orders that we have now. I don't know if that's a good idea or not personally, but it's the argument that he's making. Because he says that basically we have two choices. That the rules-based order and the nation-state system is fracturing, is fragmenting and breaking down. At the same time, you have this weird sort of consolidation of imperial power within a few different places. And he said if we don't do anything, we're heading into anarchy, and probably not the more philosophical anarchy that's kind of like little kind of like socialism and libertarian mixed together. More the anarchy as we more understand it directly, a little where there's more chaos. So we talked about the Westphalian Order. This is an extremely important treaty that most people, especially in America, know nothing about. But this is really the treaty that ended this bloody 30 Years' War, and importantly for us, it developed this system that we call nation states, and the broad outlines of sovereignty, and that these new nation states would treat each other as equals. That was kind of the basic idea. That was the idea behind the United Nations as well. And as we know, that's not what happens. And Pabst says that we're witnessing the breakdown of the Westphalian Order, and that nobody thinks that countries are treated equally anymore. Back the last 50 years or so before the Soviet Union ended, poorer countries, less powerful countries, they could kind of choose between the United States and the Soviet Union to have some sort of protection. Now we're entering in a world where we either have unipolar hegemony, where the United States gains more and more power, which we'll talk about. The U.S. could be a more expansive empire than ever before, which does not mean a prosperous society, but we could become, an extraordinarily powerful military force, more so than we already are. But then we've also, Russia's sort of on the resurgence again. China's rising very, very rapidly as well. So the fear that Pabst says is that we could, seeing the breakdown of Westphalia and the UN system, we could see a breakdown of nation states. And we already see several nation states that are pretty fragile. This was way back in 2019. Oh, remember those days when we would all go outside and go inside into restaurants and hang out together and all of that stuff. So I would say that the U.S. is not quite so stable there, maybe a bit lighter of a green. But actually, when we look at stability of countries, the U.S. is still a very, very stable country. I mean, I've studied some very, very unstable places, and there's a tremendous difference. I mean, as obnoxious and frustrating as the U.S. can be, it is not yet a failed state. I was surprised actually to see China listed here. I might lighten there to maybe a light green or lighter yellow. I don't think they're not quite in that warning stage. However, it just kind of depends on how on what happens in China in the coming years. China has an enormous population, and it's an enormously powerful country. And so one of its big challenges in the coming years will be how it's going to address the fact that about 1/4 of the population is over the age of 65. That's no small problem. So anyway, that and other things, China's got a lot of pollution it's got to deal with, so some of that may be playing in there. You see that some of the worst places are in sub-Saharan Africa. I'll be talking about North Sudan, Chad in a little bit, as well as the Democratic Republic of the Congo, two of the least stable states in the world right now. So this is here because it was supposed to be part of earlier in the lecture when I was talking about antiquity, and how we still get a lot of ideas about politics and love and literature and so on in the West from ancient Greece and from ancient Rome. And so, those ideas are still, are still very much with us today. And if we want to, look at kind of the timeline in terms of that period, the sort of axial age and so on, I kind of like this timeline here. It goes 800 years BCE, and you get the start of the Olympics. You get all these various wars, the first sacking of Rome, you have Caesar's civil war, and so on and so forth. And then you've also got, the period of the Roman Empire, classical Greece. It's obviously very, very Western focused, but it's good. It gives you a good timeline of, kind of when and where things were happening. So as I said, we're going to be talking about this rise of neo-feudalism, which is kind of interesting. And, that's what Pabst talks about. And this book, NeoMedievalism, Popular Culture in the Academy, I want to read it. It looks kind of fascinating. It looks at this looks at the growth in the fantasy industry in Hollywood and in book publications. Umberto Eco, I believe it's in this book where he first uses the term NeoMedievalism, and now it's being used by people who are studying politics and things like this. But again, a lot of this is you can see some of this. It's not just, in politics and, the decline of the nation state and so on. Those things are all happening as well. But if, a sociologist, we know that there's more going on. There's a lot going on. And one of the things that's going on is that people are reading and consuming a lot of fantasy material. And there's no way that that's happening and not having any effect on how people are thinking about things. In my Soc 1 class I taught this year, one of the books the students read was The Coming of Neo-Feudalism, A Warning to the Global Middle Class. I would highly recommend it. It's very good. It's very broad. I like it because it looks at China as well, and it kind of makes the case that China is not this communist country that is that kind of advertise themselves as, or other countries advertise them as, that they too are looking more like a feudal society than a communist society, or that the United States is looking more like a feudal society than an enterprising capitalist society. So again, I think it's very prescient reading. Now, this is just, someone who did some, attempt at looking at feudalism then and now, looking at, you had the monarchs and the gentry and the clergy and the ministers and merchants. We've kind of talked about this. Then where the feudalists are now, it's kind of hard to say. When was this made? It doesn't really say when it was made. Obviously, Obama was president. He's got black hair there, so probably early on in his presidency. But you've got the central bankers, big bankers, and corporate elite all towards the top. I would actually, I kind of agree with Charles Tilley that, we shouldn't negate the power of political rulers. I would actually move them up and say that they're more powerful than central bankers and big bankers, because at the end of the day, the bankers can't call up the military. They can't suspend the Constitution, whereas political officials have that ability. That's just my view. Anyway. So I kind of like this graphic, just kind of showing this world that we're kind of living in, where we see, a lot of wealth around us, and we see the spires of capitalism, but we also see increasingly the hordes of masses who have not been winning out in this system. And again, this is, more akin to a feudalistic society. And, a lot of people are being very open about, yes, like we talked about with the accelerationists. They want nothing more than to bring back some feudalism. An article in the Spectator, I believe a British conservative magazine, the case for bringing back feudalism. The samurai would soon bring the left to its senses and put a stop to its moral preening. I hope he wants to bring back the samurai for something other than just, combating the left or something like that. Maybe if they offer some ideas on how to, make Japan better for the Japanese people or something like that. Anyway. But you see a lot of powerful people who want this. And the thing is, that's the key thing there. Powerful people want this. And so we kind of, we're back to where we were in, the late 1800s or so, where increasingly, you've got armies mobilizing. I don't know, 2 weeks ago, you had the Russian military amassed along the border of Ukraine. China's been making movements toward Taiwan. A lot of kind of frightening stuff going on out there. And we tend to see that over time, power does become imperial. So, for example, the United States is an imperialist power, not in the same way, perhaps, as, imperialism of the past, where you just go in and, you kill the leadership and, form new leadership and take over. It's a different form of imperialism, but it's definitely still imperialism. And we tend to see that political power becomes imperialist for 3 reasons. 1, to stabilize some volatile regions. So for the U.S., that was Latin America. The Monroe Doctrine, Manifest Destiny, we're going to own most of North America. We're going to make sure that South America isn't, acting up or anything like that. Then the second thing is to secure national resources. So, make sure most of the Colorado River is going to Americans. Excuse me. And mostly to Californians, I believe so. Secure those resources that are necessary for the country and maybe not trade those. And then the quote-unquote civilizing mission, which we saw in Iraq. Well, at first we were trying to prevent weapons of mass destruction from this tiny country called Iraq that was going to imminently destroy America. And I was so... I didn't buy it for 1 second. But a lot of people did. The New York Times did, the Washington Post, The Economist, all those liberal organs of the press, they all bought it. And so when it became clear that there weren't weapons of mass destruction there, the reasoning for being there changed. We're civilizing, we're introducing democracy to Iraq. We for the most part have left Iraq now. Iraq has somewhat of a democracy, but again, these are ideas that we see that did not remain popular for too long. Let me fill my water. Okay. So, which brings us then to war, and war is something we'll talk about I believe a few other times in this class, but as we talk about this empire of anarchy and this, era of NeoMedievalism that we're entering, it's probably good that we talk about war more generally and some of the ideas that have caused so many political leaders to be confused by what has happened over the last few years. So back in 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, Francis Fukuyama, he was 40 years old, meaning that he was the same age as me, turned 40 on whatever day that was. My memory's gone now. Wednesday? No. Saturday? Friday, May 1st, Saturday, yes. Okay. Anyway, 40. So Fukuyama writes this article called The End of History, ? And in it he argues 2 things. He says basically that there are 2 things, that free market capitalism is the ideal type of economy, that this is the, we're never going to reach an economy or achieve an economy quite like this. Then the second one is that liberal or representative democracy is the most ideal form of government. We won't, come across anything or develop something better than the types of democracy that we currently have in most of the world. And this was a hugely influential article, whether people agreed with it or disagreed with it. A lot of people in power tended to agree with it because it kind of justified their worldview to some extent. And, it seemed like with the fall of the Soviet Union and more and more countries becoming democratic that perhaps Fukuyama was onto something. A few years ago, the linguist Steven Pinker wrote a book pointing out that violence has actually declined quite dramatically not only over the past few decades, but actually over the last several centuries, that it's fallen quite drastically in many, many parts of the world. We see it also in different types of war. If we just look going back to the last major war, last major war, anyone who was hurt in a war, it's a major war. Last major interstate war, world war. As you can see here, you had a lot of killing that was being done between different countries, Germany and Britain, Germany and Russia, Japan and the United States, that sort of thing. You also had a lot of civil wars that were happening. You had civil wars that were going on in the various colonies, within some of the occupied countries, and so on. Then you notice that you have a few more interstate wars in the 1960s and 70s, as a lot of the countries that had been colonies are now their own free and independent nations, but some of them are going to war with each other. And really, since the 1970s and into the 90s and 2000s, you've seen primarily civil wars. And so the idea is that, civil wars generally tend to be less destructive, as you see in interstate wars. And so the hope is that this downward trend continues. And it generally has continued, but, it's, it's one of those things. Steven Pinker has a book called Enlightenment Now, where he kind of lays out a lot of the good news. I actually recommend reading this book because, we spend so much time, I think, especially as people interested in social affairs, looking at horrible things going on, that we need to sometimes be reminded of a lot of the good things going on. I'm not as optimistic as Steven Pinker, but I do think I do recognize that he has some good insights, and we do need to be aware of the good things so that we can build on them and make them even better as we go forward. Another major theorist who talked about conflict was a political scientist named Samuel Huntington. And so he was looking at the world after the end of the Second World War, and he was noticing, too, that there are these civilizations that seem to go beyond individual countries. Oftentimes these are religion or some sort of orthodoxy. And he writes this book called The Clash of Civilizations in the 1990s, where he's basically saying that in the 21st century, since you're not having a war between, communism and capitalism anymore, it's going to be between these big civilizations like Christianity and Islam and so on. And so he has this kind of, division of the world, sub-Saharan, you've got the Muslim world, the Hindu and Western Christendom, and so on and so forth. And he says that, a lot of these religions and these belief systems are just incompatible, and they wouldn't be able to, they're not going to be able to survive with one another, and it's inevitable that you're going to have conflicts between them. Now, there, obviously, when you make a big thesis like that, you get a lot of criticism. One of the big criticisms is that it ignores diversity within civilizations. So it ignores, for example, that, it's hardly in a unified Western Christendom. You've got, various different sects of Christianity, plus you've got atheists and agnostics, people who believe in killing for Jesus, people who believe in not killing for Jesus, that sort of thing. So it's not unified, let alone, the conflict between the Sunni and Shia Muslims. And now you have, increasing divisions between Hindus. That was not quite the case, or at least he was not really focused on that when he wrote this book. So he also ignores conflict within civilizations. I kind of mentioned that as well. And I think one of the things that he also ignores is global connection. So this is more just kind of a criticism, not so much of him per se, but of the time he was writing. That it was before the internet and before people were connecting. We have more people of different different backgrounds and so on becoming connected than ever before, and that's kind of amazing. I watched an interview with him a while ago, and he was kind of pressed on some of this, and he was saying, well, maybe it's not between civilizations, maybe, you'll have clashes between, smaller cultures, and I was like, whoa, no. And you have to change the title of your book and make a completely different argument, though. You have to call it The Clash of Smaller Cultures then, because there's a huge difference between, say, Protestants and Catholics fighting and Christians and Hindus fighting or something like this. So anyway, I think he had kind of, realized that he had been criticized pretty hard and, was just trying to, salvage the theory or something like that. But anyway, you may agree with it. It may be accurate. Who knows? I kind of talked about this, and the book talks about this in more detail. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I am going to talk about colonialism. So the state breakdown chapter, which is the last chapter we're reading in the book, it talks about India and the East India Company. So make sure you read that. I'm actually going to spend some time talking about the Congo, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which it also mentions. And the reason is because, well, for one, I have more expertise studying conflicts in those areas. Also because there's a lot of things that people that people just don't know about what's been going on there. And I think it's important that people are educated in that regard. So, again, as I said, we're kind of leaving this period, or we're trying to kind of figure out how we have this period, this world of increasing numbers of people, multiculturalism, people moving across the world, while at the same time people are trying to hold on to their traditional cultures, their traditional values and ideas. I don't think we should look at, nationalists and people who want to hold on to those ideals as, being backwards people or something like this, or anything like that. What I do think is that we do need to figure out some way in which we can recognize the importance of these sort of cultural values for people, while at the same time, recognizing that we are in this increasingly multicultural world. Yeah, easy stuff like that. So, anyway, that's essentially, why Lord Shang and Hobbes said that, we need some strong government. I think I used to be more of an anarchist, kind of opposed to the idea of a strong government. I'm not an authoritarian like Hobbes or Lord Shang or any of them. But I do think that we need a strong government that holds things together, at least for now. So we're going to talk about failed states, and the reason, and so like I said, I'm going to talk about Africa because sometimes it's not really talked about as much in sociology. Especially, my main areas of expertise are in parts of the Sahel over here and the Congo. I'm not going to go through all of this. This is just kind of, you can look at it on your own time. But just, giving some idea, there's over 2,000 languages that are spoken there. It has over 170 million Arab speakers. You've got a wide, variety of religions, a wide variety of natural habitats. I forget, like the United States could fit like right here, Europe could fit right here. Africa is enormous. It's just the landmass itself is quite huge. Oh, by the way, this lecture is going to go on and on for a while, so feel free to pause and take a break if you need to. So when we talk about failed states, so Africa right now has more failed states than anywhere else in the world, and a lot of it is clustered down in Central Africa. Excuse me. Failed state, basically a state that can no longer perform its basic security and developmental functions. You kind of see where some of this arises in the book where it talks about colonialism. And I think I may have talked about that, unless that was in another class at another university 2 years ago. I don't know. Anyway, if I didn't talk about that, I will in a future lecture. Oh, I forgot to change the font here to black. Okay, so this is Paul Collier. He's a developmental economist at Oxford. He's written some very influential books. One that pertains to what we're talking about today is called The Bottom Billion: Why the Poorest Countries Are Failing and What Can Be Done About It. And he gives these 4 traps that he sees a lot of countries fall into. And then once you're in 1 or 2 of these traps, let alone all 4 or something, it becomes very difficult to break free. So in Africa, for example, we see that a lot of places are experiencing what he calls the conflict trap. Currently, there are around 15 African countries or so that are experiencing internal wars. It's estimated around 9 million people have died as a result of war, direct result of war, since 1947. That's not counting, famines and malnutrition, disease, and all the other things that accompany war as well. Now, it's also important to recognize that, Africa, there's this belief by people who don't pay attention to these things that, things are just constantly deteriorating in Africa. It's just getting worse and worse. And it's actually not true. The peak of violence was in the early 1990s, and it was so bad that this journalist, Robert Kaplan, wrote an article called, I believe it was called The Coming Anarchy, and it was looking at some West African country where there was truly a lot of anarchy and conflict and so on, and he's basically saying the world's going to be like this in a number of years. And I forget where in Africa he was writing, but even that country now isn't like that anymore. They've got better, their democracy is working well, and the conflict is over, and so on and so forth. And actually, in contrast to what he and many others were thinking, where they just saw, continual violence, violent conflicts have fallen by half since 1999. So in the last 20 years, you've seen a huge drop in violent conflict. So a lot of African countries are breaking free from the conflict trap, and that's one of the hardest ones to break out of. Closely connected with that is what's called the natural resource trap. These are countries, they don't even have to be countries, that can be like cities or towns even, counties, that become dependent upon some natural resource and that becomes their main commodity. And that's, they're, as long as people are, wanting coffee, and, you've got lots of coffee, fields of coffee plants, then, your country's doing well. But, all of a sudden some other country comes along and they've got, coffee that's even cheaper, then it wounds you. Or this is the case, this is the more, I think, worrisome case, things like oil or timber, natural resources that are either polluting or that are running out. And you start to see the price rises, or importantly, people shift to new energy forms and things like this. So, for example, if the royal family in Saudi Arabia, if they have any brains among them, they should be building a lot of solar panels, across their deserts, because that oil is not going to last forever. And so a lot of countries are stuck in this natural resource trap. On the one end, you've got like those rich countries like Saudi Arabia, but most of them are countries like Africa that are basically being exploited by multinational companies and other countries. Closely related is the natural resource trap. No, that is the same. I'm talking about the same thing. I was like, wait, isn't this the same? Yeah. Okay. So as I said, you've got a lot of African countries that are stuck in this. So Africa produces nearly 50% of the gold in the world, which is, the irony there is, gold is a very precious metal, and used to be the most precious of all metals, and, how we determine what money was worth and so on and so forth. And yet Africa is a very, very poor country. Once again, Africa produces about half the diamonds in the world. Diamonds, these, priceless things that, that we give loved ones and so on and so forth. Again, but a lot of them in Africa are not getting much of the profit. So again, you've got a lot of these African countries, and I'll talk more about this in a moment, that are stuck in this natural resource trap. Then you've got the geography trap, and this is one that really people don't think that much about because it's perhaps less obvious as the other ones. So this is often places where, there's things like the climate just works against them, or, and this is often the case, they're landlocked. They don't have a port. They don't have access to the sea. Maybe they're resource rich, but in order to get it to the next country, they have to pay a big tariff or something like this. Or maybe they're resource scarce and they have to bring in resources that cost more money. So again, this is one of those traps that a lot of people don't think about. And then finally, the bad governance trap, where basically you've got, where you've got this aid that's supposed to be going to the population, people that need it, and it's going to, and it's going to, the corrupt leaders and so on and so forth. Whoops. Just to give you some idea, you've got this from 2004, but actually I'll show a different map later. But basically you can see here that there's, a lot of conflict and a lot of places where there are a lot of resources. So resources does not necessarily mean, that you're going to have a peaceful country. Oftentimes it's been the opposite. One of the major tragedies in Africa, and in my own research on conflict in Africa, is looking at the large number of child soldiers. Now, we have to remember that throughout most of history, most soldiers have been children. I mean, most soldiers have been teenagers that have been fighting, and then people in their 20s. And so in places where you have a lot of men in their 20s who have already been killed, or you just need more forces, you start to see younger children then recruited into the military. And it was actually when I was teaching at UCSB, when I taught there, what was the class? The Introduction to Global and International Studies. We spent a lot of time talking about this, talking about child soldiers and things like that. I mean, so, some of these images are just, really tragic. Just seeing these very young kids with these weapons that, are just, very, very, very murderous. So what was going on here? Who was giving these kids these guns? These weren't guns that were being manufactured in America. I mean, well, actually, they were being manufactured in America and Europe. A lot of the pictures that I just showed you were in West Africa or in Angola and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So basically, during the 1990s, you had what are called the Diamond Wars, and they were fought in these different countries. Over 100,000 people were killed. You had a number of Western companies like De Beers and others who, if they didn't exactly supply the weapons directly, they supplied the funding to, all the various different sideways groups that eventually then gets the guns for these different groups. So you had these ethnic groups then that were turned against each other for diamond wealth. And there's a movie about this called Blood Diamond that came out a few years ago. One thing that you also saw in these diamond wars that kind of characterized them, and I'll kind of explain the history in a moment. You had a number of people, young children, women who had limbs that were cut off. So you can see in these pictures here, this girl's like, what, 4 or something, 3 or 4, had her arm chopped off. This 17-year-old lost both hands to a rebel machete. All of this, again, happening for the Diamond Wars. Now, to go back in time, and if we want to understand the Diamond Wars, and if we want to understand, okay, why were so many people getting their hands chopped off, we have to go back to the Berlin Conference of 1884. Sorry, that font is green. It was a different color in the background. Anyway, I'll try and change that to black. But the Berlin Conference of 1884, that was the last kind of European conference where they tried to lay out boundaries. The big difference was that these weren't boundaries within Europe. They were boundaries within Africa. And of course, no Africans were allowed in. And, they just got maps together, looked at where rivers were and where mines were and that sort of thing. And they kind of, developed where each European nation, where their colonies would be. Now, what they didn't pay any attention to were that some of these lines, say like right here, divide a bunch of different ethnic groups up. So all of a sudden, some ethnic groups are now on one side, some of the same ones are on the other, and, it becomes kind of a problem. Just another map of what I just showed you, if you just want to take another look at it, different colors, that sort of thing. So again, here it's got some of the rivers like the Nile right here, and so on. So we know that colonialism did a number of things. So it destroyed many tribal empires, societies, created national boundaries. I kind of went over this. It also led to the loss of wildlife and increased environmental degradation. As, Europeans went around and like, oh, look at all these birds. And they're like, oh, no, there's no birds anywhere. So that's, been kind of the story of colonialism as well. After the Second World War, Europe gave up a lot of their colonies for two reasons. One, they were kind of pushed to by America. The United States, having been a colony, was actually kind of on the right side here by saying, you should, get rid of this whole colony idea. That should be just the legacy of the past. And even if the European powers didn't want to do that, there's no way that they could have maintained control over the colonies, considering most of their own cities were in rubble. So there's this famous, saying, the white man's burden. It was this idea that it was the job of the enlightened white Christian European man to go and save Africa and so on. But this book by Basil Davidson, The Black Man's Burden, Africa and the Curse of the Nation State, is much more accurate, and does a good job of showing just how the formation of the nation state led to so many of the problems that we see today in Africa. We've seen, Nelson Mandela become freed from prison, became a global figure for resistance, and things like that. You also have the International Monetary Fund, where they try to help Africa or help corporate investors in Africa using what are called structural adjustment programs. So they'd give them loans to build a dam or something like this, or for some agricultural project. But again, they're just kind of pushing these, and this is kind of the critique that Adrian Pabst has in his Commonwealth and Covenant article, that they're just kind of pushing these political and economic models on countries while ignoring the social and cultural ties. And by doing that, it just kind of ends up being rather disastrous. So I'm going to talk about two countries in some detail. One is the Democratic Republic of the Congo. You can read these later. I'll upload the slides later too. You had about 3.2 million people that were killed in that conflict between 1998 and 2003. Sometimes it's called Africa's World War. And then Darfur and Sudan. Sudan is sometimes called the second largest country in Africa. Some parts have a lot of oil, others do not. Darfur is kind of a more desert-like area that's been marginalized. You had rebel groups attack, and then the Sudanese military responded with a genocidal campaign. So I'll start with the Democratic Republic of the Congo. You can kind of see where it is. It's the largest country in Africa. I forget, you can fit like almost half the United States in the Congo. It's really kind of wild. So as Maurice Carney, former executive director of Friends of the Congo in Washington, D.C., said, you have two types of rape happening in the Congo. One is the rape of women and children. The other is of land and natural resources. The Congo has tremendous natural resources. 30% of the world's cobalt, 10% of the world's copper, 80% of the world's reserves of coltan. So basically, without cobalt, without copper, and without coltan, the economy that we know it no longer ceases to exist. Computing devices won't work, and so on and so forth. So right now, the entire world, our communications, our economies, and everything, or almost everything, is dependent on some resources that are coming out of one of the most unstable and most violent places on Earth. So how did it get to be that way? The book talks about some of this, and again, I apologize for the green lettering here, but so King Leopold of Belgium. Belgium, if you look at a map, is a pretty small country. King Leopold of Belgium, in that 1885 Berlin Conference, he got the Congo, and, he really wanted some stuff there. It was a big big landmass and so on. He never actually went there by himself, but he did want to make sure that he got the wealth that was coming out of there. If you're interested in the story of the Congo and King Leopold, I highly recommend King Leopold's Ghost. So King Leopold, probably haven't heard of him. He's basically a mass murderer who ranks up there with Hitler, with Stalin, with Mao. We just, for whatever reason, don't learn about him as much. So he basically created a slavery system to extract rubber from trees. And remember, this early 1900s, so people are wanting rubber for all sorts of, tires for bicycles and automobiles and for, factory systems and things like this. They're starting to find diamonds there, so the diamond trade is starting to begin there. And it's a very, very brutal type of colonialism, more brutal, in fact, than any of the colonialism you had seen since, the Spanish conquistadors or the wiping out of certain Native American tribes. It's estimated he killed between 10 to 15 million people in the Congo. We also saw that during this time, this is when the first modern mass human rights movement develops to oppose Belgian colonialism in the Congo. And you can see some of the cartoons in the press. You've got an African there, and the wife and child are running away, and he's being strangled by King Leopold, the snake with King Leopold's head, and it's called In the Rubber Coils. And here you've got King Leopold, stealing all the money that's being gotten from the Congo, while the colonialists are attacking the Congolese people. So this is interesting too, because this is starting to be the time period. This is kind of after the ending of slavery, but you still have a lot of people that are against segregation. You still have the abolitionist movement, but now kind of looking at other exploitation happening in the colonies. So you get this happening at this time now too. Just one indication of how dangerous and backbreaking it is. 1 ton of rubber usually took about around 8 lives. And this is worse than the sugar slavery. I don't know what cotton slavery is. I don't know how many lives it took to get one ton of cotton. That's a lot of cotton, because cotton's not exactly known for its weightiness. But tapping rubber trees is pretty hard work. You've got to, get it just right, and, they don't give you, anyway, it looks like something that none of us probably want to do. So King Leopold dies in comfort and luxury. He's not, tried for war crimes or anything like that, since those things haven't really come into existence yet. So moving kind of fast forward ahead to the 1960s, you have Patrice Lumumba, who is the first democratically elected president of the Congo. Unfortunately, though, for him and for the Congolese, he was a socialist or a communist, and the United States didn't really like that, so they backed this guy named Joseph Mobutu, who overthrew Lumumba in a coup, and Mobutu ruled the Congo with an iron fist until 1998, and he was a very brutal dictator. And then, so what happens then is what you saw after Saddam Hussein died, after Gaddafi died. After a dictator dies, then there's often different forces that are competing for power. So there's a good book about this by Gerard Prunier, who I know from my own research on conflict in Africa, where he called Africa's World War, Congo, the Rwandan genocide, and the making of a continental catastrophe. Yeah, not very many people know about it. Like I said, about 3 to 5 million people that were killed. I don't mean to in any way negate the suffering in the conflict, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but I think in that same time period, you've had maybe 5 to 10,000 deaths, if even that. Can you imagine if 2 to 3 million people died? If not Israel, Palestine, but pretty much anywhere, except I guess the Congo. The other thing about the Congo is that more women there are raped there than anywhere else in the world, and you're starting to see a lot of sex trafficking going on now. It was just the rape that always accompanies military conflict. And now you're seeing the destabilization of societies, and young girls and boys are being kidnapped and sold into sex trafficking and so on. So pretty bad situation there. And the world has done a pretty good job of averting our eyes. Like I said, we depend upon the slavery systems out there. So if you're, get on your smartphone and you're feeling all high and mighty, and you're texting about how awful people were back in the 1800s when, even if they were opposed to slavery, when they still bought, stuff that was made out of cotton, that was made from, picked by slaves and so on. Before you pass moral judgments on them, think about where your own resources come from. If you're using a phone, or if you're using a computer, which you probably are if you're using this, more than likely some of that is dependent upon some child labor, and almost definitely certain systems of slavery. So those systems are still well alive today. So as I said, coltan is used in virtually all modern electronic devices. Very kind of interesting there. So when I started my graduate research, I started my research on conflict in Darfur, which then led me to start studying everything I could about Sudan, Chad, and other parts of the region. Darfur is about the size of Texas. Sudan had, and this slide is a little bit out of date, he's now been arrested, but Sudan had a civil war between what's now the South, the Southern Sudan, or South Sudan, and they have some They have some oil there that unfortunately is now causing conflict between different southern Sudanese groups over who's going to benefit from that. But for about 20 years, you had war between the Islamic north of the country and the Christian animist south, and that was going on since about 1982. Omar al-Bashir took power in 1989. He intensified the war, but began attacking Darfur, because in Darfur, what happened was, this was a part of the country that had been ignored, and so you had rebels then attack sort of police stations and army stations and things like that. The military retaliated not by attacking, the military, the paramilitary militias or whatever. They went on a scorch and burn campaign of the civilian population. So they would have planes fly through first, drop some bombs, then they would have what were called a Janjaweed, which would ride in on these camels and cattle. I won't go through all of this. This is a little bit more detailed than is necessary for the point of this lecture. But the basic idea was you had this group called the Four that they were not nomadic, they were settled, they were generally peaceful, but they were not getting they were not getting treated well by the government. Now, this group of Bagara and Abala herders, they herd cattle and camels and things like that. They had also been militarized during the 1980s, during a drought and during some other regional conflicts. So then they became known as the Janjaweed, the devils on horseback. And so they would ride into these villages after a few bombs had been dropped, and then they would attack and often kill most of the men, rape many of the women, burn the villages, and then the Sunnese military would come in. As I said, the Four, the Dar means homeland of Darfur means homeland of the Four. So the Four, as I said, are farmers, marginalized. And in recent years, because of the drought, because of climate change, you've seen increased competition with those herders over scarce land. Now, this is interesting because back in the 1960s, an anthropologist looked at these two groups, and he saw them as some of the most peaceful groups in the world. You know, they got along so well, and that was late 1960s. And here we are in the early 2000s, and you have one of the first genocides of the century happen between those two groups. And so, essentially my research question was, okay, what the hell happened here? A big part of it, as I said, was drought. So a lot of those herds, their herd sizes dropped dramatically. Some of them that herded camels, they lost most of their livestock. When things like this happen to people, it's very easy for them to think that the world's ending and to be militarized and brainwashed into thinking something. So here you've got the central area of Darfur, and here you've got the northern area, which looks like a better place to graze your livestock. And you can see that there's actually a fairly close relationship between falls in conflict and rises. I mean, falls in rainfall and rises in conflict. Not exact, but as I said, they play one of many roles. Other big role was played by Colonel Gaddafi in Libya. He was trying to start a pan-Arab part of northern Africa, so he was recruiting various Arab herders and promoting ideas of Arab supremacy. And so it's really that more than anything else, I think, that mobilized this group that was already, suffering from ecological conditions. And, you were saying, it's those Four, it's those, they're the ones who are the root of all your problems, that sort of thing. And so then when the Four started to attack, Omar al-Bashir just mobilized those Janjaweed militias. Around 1 million people have been killed now. We don't know how many tens of thousands of women have been raped. For a while, the conflict was dropping, and I was glad to see that, but just in recent months, the conflict has continued. The other thing that's been kind of alarming, so these groups of the Janjaweed who have military experience now fighting in Darfur, they're essentially mercenary forces. So they've been hired by Saudi Arabia to fight Yemen. So that's it's just more terrible stuff coming out of this conflict. The good news, and I think this is something that you should think about, that it's not a big campaign at the moment because, the lot of the fighting has died down, but American college students did more than anyone else in the world to spread awareness and raise relief funds for Darfur, and that did make a difference, and I think it's very important. And it's important that we recognize that Africa, like I said, is changing. Conflict has fallen by half. You have freedom. People like Nelson Mandela, who had been freed, who have provided inspiration for a lot of people. Women's rights are on the rise in many places. You have sex education on the rise. You have microfinance systems being set up. You also have community conservation. So instead of poaching for money, you try to conserve, what elephants and rhinos are left. One problem here, though, is that a lot of this relies on tourists coming to, see the savannah and so on, and coronavirus has kind of killed that. So we might actually see some poaching go back up. But this is, again, another area where we've seen some successes. And if you ever get the chance to see a child soldier or former child soldier speak out and talk out, it's really an incredible thing. I mean, the things that these boys have seen and other men have seen and in many cases done is just, it's really horrific. On the one hand, it's terrifying, and you wonder, if you just heard that description, you'd be just, oh, the person is an evil monster. And then if you just kind of heard this description or met this person and talked to him and Ishmael and didn't know that he had been a child soldier, and you're just talking about regular stuff, you think, oh, this is a great guy. This guy's a wonderful person. And I think it's kind of what I like about that is it shows how the spectrum that we can, certain conditions can make us act in certain ways. And so, we should try to do our best to not be a failed state. Other hero of mine from Africa, Wangari Maathai, founder of the Green Belt Movement, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1994, first woman from East Africa to get her PhD. So what she started was this tree planting movement, basically recognizing that there's a lot of deforestation going on and that, people could band together by replanting the forests and, bringing back the wildlife and old customs and so on. So Africa is on the rise, and, keep in mind that Europe, America, even China, these are countries that are getting older. The populations are getting grayer. Africa has the youngest population of any continent on the world. Where do you think the action's going to be? And when we look at the relationships of trade relationships, remember a lot of the raw materials that keep the modern economy going, like coltan and so on, are coming out of the Congo and other parts of Africa, and the vast majority of that is going to China. Not that that's necessarily a good or a bad thing, just something we should probably be aware of. And in general, that's, I think, kind of the new story of in Africa that we need more research on and need to look at in more detail, and that's the the inclusion. That's not the word I'm looking for. China moving in many ways to do some good, to develop new places of employment and things like this. At the same time, you've also got some old imperialism going on, right? You just have some resource extraction that's happening. But that's going to be a very important relationship that may determine the future of the human race. You've got the most people in the world in China, the world's fastest rising economy. And then you've got Africa, the youngest continent in the world that's got, most of the precious metals that the modern economy needs. So anyway, let's try to keep states from breaking down. All right, everyone. So that's making up for this lecture last week. I will be, well, there's actually a good segue then, because next week we'll be talking pretty much just about China and the Chinese political model. All right, everyone. I hope you are having a good weekend.